Um, if we look now at some of the reasons that people have criticized this approach, there's a man named Hanafi Ahmad who wrote some books on miracles in the Qur'an. First edition was published in 1954 with reprints in 1960 and 68. He apparently got a bachelor's degree in science from a British university, and he worked in the Egyptian Ministry of Education. Here's an example of one of his attempts to read something into the Quran. It probably isn't there. Near the end of Surah Naml, on the day when the translation goes, on the day when the trumpet will be blown, there's some words taken out here to sort of get to his scientific point. On the day when the trumpet will be blown, all who are in the heavens and the earth will start in fear, and one sees the mountains apparently solid, yet passing like clouds. Now, somehow or other, he thought that phrase, mountains apparently solid, yet passing like clouds, that it refers to the revolution of the earth. In the 1954 version of the book, he wrote that the verse states that the earth and the mountains on its surface wander through space. Some years later, an article was published in the Azhar University Journal on scientific exegesis, and it criticized statements like that on the basis that they disregard the position and the context of the verses cited. And it quoted that verse in particular and the interpretation of it. It says, if the commentator would read what precedes the verse and what follows it, he would perceive that the verse describes what will happen to the mountains on the last day. So the next time that he published the book, he took out that portion that had been criticized without any acknowledgement that there was something there that was a response to criticism. And so Jansen is somebody who is an Orientalist who studied Egyptian society in particular. He wrote a book called, I believe it's the same author, he wrote a book called Militant Islam. But he wrote a slim little volume on modern tafseer, 20th century tafseers in Egypt. And the 2 points that he has to make about somebody like Hassan al-Hanafi in particular, he says that he imposes distinctions between words, the Arabic words, that are dubious. And he reads scientific knowledge into the text that would not have been hidden from any observant biped. I mean, he's really dissing the man and some of the excesses of this approach. There are some other scholars who make occasional use of it. Examples of that are Abdul-Majeed al-Badis, and who is an Algerian scholar from the 30s. There's an Iranian, I believe he's Iranian, he's a Shiite anyway, Tabatabai. He died in 1982. He has a tafseer that's pretty famous called al-Mizan, and he does some of that. He has scattered examples of this approach. Now, the critics of this approach, they include scholars like Muhammad Rashid Rida, and most prominently Amin al-Khuli, who is a teacher at what became Cairo University, and he sort of established a whole school of tafsir that approaches the Quran as a literary work. And others, like Sayyid Qutb, they criticized it. Al-Khuli did the most extensive criticism. He had 5 major points. First, that it's lexicographically untenable, since it falsely attributes modern meanings to Quranic vocabulary. Now, a classic example of that is there's a verse that mentions that something as small as a dhurra or even smaller than it. And dhurra, in modern Arabic, it refers to the atom. So whoever made use of that verse, they said, well, this shows that Allah was talking about subatomic particles. And this is a miraculous kind of knowledge. But dhurra in the usage of the Arabs at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, it meant those little particles of dust that you can see floating in sunlight. So that's an invalid approach to interpretation, because it's using meanings that were not present at the time of the revelation. Secondly, as we pointed out in that Hasan al-Hanafi approach, it ignores the context of the words or the phrases within the Quranic text, and frequently it also ignores asbab al-nuzul. And then he makes a point that the Quran was addressed to a people, and these people lived in the 7th century, I guess, 7th century Arabia, and so it was addressing people at that level of knowledge and etc. And to try to read into it later knowledge is not tenable. Now, I don't agree with that criticism at all, because you can be addressing somebody in a way that they will understand and yet still encode information into the message that will only become apparent to people with a higher level of learning. So some things may go over the head of the initial audience, but they get something from it still. So that whole argument to me doesn't carry a lot of weight. Number 4, it has a certain amount of weight. It says that the proponents or the practitioners of this type of tafsir, they take the current state of knowledge as truth, and then they try to show how the Qur'an is in accord with the current state of knowledge. But scientific knowledge is always changing, and its conclusions are provisional. Now, there's a part of that can be accepted, and there's a part of that that's problematic to me. The example of, say, Newtonian physics, that it was disproved on a certain level with Einstein's theory, or let's say that there were things about it that certain facts could no longer be squared with Newtonian physics on the cosmic level. And Einstein's theory explains those things better. Now, that doesn't mean that Newtonian physics was disproved in total. It just means that on a certain level, its conclusions didn't fit observable fact. But in certain other areas, it still remains an operative theory. So, there are certain things that are pretty much well established. For someone to say, well, it's not really established that the Earth goes around the sun, that's silly. So, there are certain aspects of scientific knowledge which are provisional, and there are others which are pretty much proven. So, distinguishing between the two is important. And Khuli's 5th criticism was that, when you take this approach, you start reading all the scientific stuff into the Qur'an, you actually lose sight of its main purpose, which was that it was revealed for human guidance. And these other things they're not the point. They're something which is incidental. It's off on the margins, and that's a valid point. But there's also a valid issue which gives this approach validity, and that is the whole epistemological issue that if you have internal consistency, that's provisional sign that a text is true, and if it's internally inconsistent, then that's a sure sign that it's not from the creator of the universe. Doesn't have a divine source. But as some philosophers of science have pointed out, you can have an internally coherent fairy tale. So if you don't link it to the outside world and observable fact, then it remains unverified. And so the fact that statements are made about observable reality, those can be checked out, and it pins that text to reality in a way that makes us concede that the book has a source beyond that of limited human understanding. So there is a place for it, but it isn't the main point of the Qur'an or of tafsir. Now, I did want to mention Abdul-Majeed al-Zindaanee in brief. I mean, he hasn't written a tafsir, but he's put out a lot of cassette tapes, or some of his lectures have been recorded and circulated. And he's very much a proponent of this whole philosophy. And I've listened to some of his tapes and found them really interesting. And I think that he has avoided a lot of the points of criticism that al-Khuli had pointed out, and that he took this approach to a whole other level. And I think he's done valuable work on this. And Allah knows best. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.